love those old songs. I almost feel like we need to break out a tent and do a revival out here or something. But no, that song is one that I hear talking about God waiting on us, watching for us, looking for us, calling us to come home. It feels like the story of the prodigal son, right? It's almost like God is looking for us and just waiting on us to come back and join in. So I hope that this is a day where that is the type of connection that you will have with the Father today. I hope this is a day where you can enjoy that. This week at Trailhead has been a busy but good week. Some of you know that we had a kids camp this week, sports camp for 1st through 5th graders. And we had 70 to 75 kids there every day. And we as adults are still a little bit exhausted from all that went on this week. But the kids had a ton of fun. We had 3 kids that accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior this week. So that was an awesome thing. Really incredible to see what God is doing in the lives of kids around Wellington. And it's such a privilege to be a part of that. If you're new with us, if this is your first time here at Trailhead, we do something where every once in a while we'll do a message series where we actually read through a book of the Bible together, and we do it really simply. So we just read one chapter a day of whatever book we're going through, and then we will come together at the end of the week and we will talk about something from those 7 chapters that we've been reading. Right now we're going through 1st and 2nd Samuel. I know you've been waiting expectantly, hoping that we would get to 1st and 2nd Samuel sometime soon. And so we're doing that now. This past week we read chapters 15 through 21. And if you haven't been reading with us, this is good stuff. This is a good week to kind of catch up. But this past week we read about David and Goliath. We read about David and Jonathan, their friendship. There was a point where we read about David acting insane so that he could kind of get away from some people, and he's like drooling down his beard and acting like he's a crazy man. I know all of us have felt like doing that at times to get away from somebody, but David actually did it in 1 Samuel chapter 21. But this week we'll pick up and start in chapter 22 and read through 28, so I hope that you'll jump in with us. As we go through this book, what we're calling this series is we're calling it the Game of Thrones. And the reason we're calling it that is because all of us have something in our lives. We have emotions, we have attitudes, we have something that's sitting on the throne of our lives that at any point in time is driving us, is directing us. And that may change. You know, it doesn't take long for whatever is on that throne to be replaced by something else. We've talked about the fact that you can be looking at somebody and feel absolutely in love with them and passionately in love with them in one moment, and then 5 minutes later they do something that is incredibly annoying, and so all of a sudden you've gone from having love as what's ruling your heart to having frustration or anger or bitterness or whatever it is. And the question that we're asking in this series is, how do we get off of this game? How do we get out of this Game of Thrones, this revolving throne in our hearts? How do we get to a point where it's not, I want to follow the things of God, you know, right now, and then 10 minutes later, well, I like the things of God, but I think I want to do my own thing for just a minute. How do we get to a point of focus and clarity in the things that we are doing in life? And I believe that's a lot of what 1st and 2nd Samuel teach us, a lot of what it's about. So like I said, we're going to be walking through this in 1 Samuel chapter 15 in a few minutes. But before we dive into that, Jamie and I, not long after we got married, we made a huge move in life. We were living in Northern California, just outside of San Francisco, and we moved from California to Mississippi. So you can imagine, that's not only culturally a huge shift, but that's a long way to go, a long way across the country. And like I said, we had only been married for a few months, 3 or 4 months, so we packed up everything we owned, which was like a bed and a TV, and that was about it at that point in time. And we loaded that in the car and started driving across the country. The one other thing that we owned at that particular point in time was something that I married into, and that was a cat named Pinky. We actually called her Stinky Pinky for more reasons than you would want to know. But Stinky Pinky was sitting, you know, as we drove across the country, we were in a Jeep. I'm in this seat, Janie's in this seat, and Pinky's in a cage in the middle of us. And we're driving across the country. And like the second day, we stopped for lunch. I don't remember exactly where we were. It was Arizona or New Mexico or one of those places where you've just seen a sign that said, there is no more gas for like 395 miles, right? So if you're going to stop and get gas, this is the place you better do. So we stopped there, and there was a parking lot that housed several businesses. One of them was a Walmart, one of them was a Wendy's, and so we stopped and ate lunch. And after we ate lunch there, we were just talking about the next stage of our trip, the next stage of where we were going. And I don't know why this didn't occur to me earlier, but it just kind of hit me, okay, that Walmart's right there, and we don't have any fix-a-flat or anything like that, emergency kind of stuff if we need it. So this was our plan. I said, JD, you take the cat, and this was kind of comical in itself, but she had the cat on a leash. You take the cat on a leash, in the grass in front of Wendy's, so she can do her stinky pinky thing. And I'm going to go to Walmart, and I'm going to get the emergency supplies that we need. And it was a big parking lot, but, it was the same parking lot, so I wasn't going very far. So I go into Walmart, I get the stuff, and it didn't take very long, but it was like any other time you go to Walmart, right? There's 17 aisles you can go to, and there's one person that's working a counter. And so I stand in line for a few minutes, I check out after 5 minutes, and come drive around to pick up JD. And when I went to pick her up, she's standing in front of Wendy's in the grass, holding the cat, and she just has tears streaming down her face. And I thought, oh no, we've only been married like 3 months, and I've already broken her. I don't know what's going on, And so she gets in the car, and I'm like, what's wrong? And typical JD fashion, I'm happy, nothing's wrong, everything's good. And I was like, that's why you got mascara all over your face, right? Because you're happy. And the more we talked about it, the more I started to figure out that she was struggling, and I kind of knew this before, but she was struggling with the fear of abandonment. And she thought that I had brought her out into the middle of Arizona or New Mexico or wherever we were, and I was just taking off and leaving her with the cat, standing there in front of Wendy's. And it's heartbreaking. That's a sad thing. I don't know if you've ever dealt with that before. I don't know if you've ever experienced loss that caused you to feel the fear of abandonment. But I can almost guarantee you that you have something that you fear. I have something that I fear. I can almost guarantee that every one of us in here have certain things that we fear in life. For you, maybe it's the loss of someone, maybe the loss of a child, or the loss of another child. Yeah, maybe your fear is not the loss of a person, but it's the fear of being inadequate, not living up to expectations or not having enough. Maybe it's the fear of not being a good enough provider for your family. Or fear of not making it in the career that you've chosen. I don't know what it is, but all of us have certain things where we look up, and these things tend to kind of drive us at times. Whether it's fear of crowds, and you say, you know what, I'm not wanting to get baptized because I don't want to stand in front of everybody. We've had so many people tell us that have been baptized. I've been putting this off because I'm afraid to get in front of people. Whatever your fear is, all of us have certain things that tend to rise up in our lives. And these are the things that cause us to stay awake at night. We can't sleep because it's just going around in our brains. It may be a fear over a relationship or a fear over a situation or whatever it is. But all of us tend to wrestle with these things, some more than others. And so the question that we're asking this morning is, how can we take that out of this Game of Thrones? How can we get rid of this fear element that tends to rise up and tends to drive us? And when it drives us, I don't know if you've noticed this, but when fear is the thing that is driving us, it tends to drive us into the ditch. It tends to drive us off course, off where we're supposed to be going. So how can we get that out of the mix so that we're focused on the things of God rather than focused on the things of fear? Here's the good news that is seen all throughout Scripture that I think we're going to see to some degree this morning. The really cool news about fear and how we relate to fear is that even when you should be afraid at times, if you are with God, you don't have to be afraid. Even when there are things that maybe should be concerning to you, if you are with God, they don't have to become big worries in your life. And so we're going to see that in 1 Samuel chapter 15 as we look at the story of a guy named Saul and Samuel. just to bring you up to speed, if you hadn't been with us, the guy that's the king of Israel at this time is the first king ever here. It's a guy named Saul. Last week we talked about the fact that the nation of Israel kind of went to God, and they said, God, we're tired of you telling us what to do, and we kind of want to do our own thing. So God had all along been telling them, you don't want to be like the other nations around you. And we explained that last week, but he said, don't be like the nations around you. And they look up and they say, you know what, God? We want to be like the nations around us. We want to have a king like they have a king. We want to be led by a man the way that they're led by a man. And God says, if you go that route, he says, I'm not going to stop you, but you might get yourself into a mess. And he kind of lists, these are things that are going to happen if you select a man to be your king. And they say, in spite of that, we still want to do it. We still want to have a man as our king. They get Saul to be their king. And Saul he's a decent guy. He's really not a bad guy. But he's like a lot of us. He has this problem of he's playing the Game of Thrones. He's sitting on the throne of Israel, but inside of him, he has different motivations, different attitudes, different things that are driving him at times. And what you're going to see today is that the attitude of fear ends up driving him in a way that's very unhealthy. So 1 Samuel chapter 15 is where we're going to be. We'll start in verse 1. And as we start, it's a guy named Samuel talking to Saul. Samuel's the guy that the book is named after here. He is the one who is the judge of Israel. He's leading Israel back to God. But as he's doing that, he's also considered a prophet. So he speaks for God on behalf of God. And this is the role that he's in as he confronts Saul here. Samuel the prophet speaking to Saul the king. All right. So verse 1, Samuel said to Saul, I'm the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over this people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. And just to hit pause for a second here, if you're familiar with ancient Hebrew, I know all of you guys love to study ancient Hebrew, right? If you're familiar with Hebrew in the scripture, you may know that ancient Hebrew didn't have punctuation marks. And so the way they would emphasize something, if they wanted to put like an exclamation point at the end of a sentence, is they would repeat it. They would say it more than once. And that's exactly what's happening here. So if you notice at the end of verse 1, Samuel says, so listen to the message from the Lord. And right after that, he just repeats it. He says, this is what the Lord Almighty says. And that's just to put an exclamation point on it. That's to say, this is the word of God. Pay attention to this. I'm not just making this up. This isn't just for fun that we're reading. I'm telling you what God is telling me. All right? And this is what he says to me. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. This is kind of hard stuff to swallow. If you keep reading this, it says, do not spare them. Put to death the men and women, the children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Let's just be honest for a minute. If you read that and just kind of pass by it, it's one of those points where you say, I'm not so sure this is the God that I know, right? We just sang a song about the good, good Father, and now we're reading a passage about him saying, I want you to go to this nation of people, the Amalekites, and utterly wipe them off the face of the earth. Not only just go to war with them, but just wipe them out. Why in the world would God say to do that? Let me just give you a little history, and it's still hard to swallow, but this is kind of a simplified version of what's going on, okay? So the Amalekites and the Israelites are enemies, but they are actually relatives. If you remember stories from the book of Genesis, there's a point where two guys are born, twins, Jacob and Esau. Jacob ends up having his name changed to Israel. His family line becomes the nation of Israel. Esau goes and does his own thing, but he has a son. He ends up having a grandson. The grandson's name is Amalek. So Amalek becomes the head of the Amalekites, and they kind of become enemies of the people of Israel. Even though they're relatives, they start fighting against each other. The Amalekites are nomads. They just kind of wander around. And there's a point where, if you remember where Moses goes down to bring the people out of Egypt, let my people go, that whole thing. If you remember that, the people of Israel come out of Egypt, and as they're headed up toward the promised land, the Amalekites come and attack them. But they don't just come and say, hey, we like to fight, let's do this. Let's stand face to face, toe to toe, and let's go to war. They don't do that. In fact, they're more like Vikings. They just pillage and plunder. They go in and they attack people in very, very difficult ways, in ways that you would never attack if you have any ethics in terms of war. And so what they did is, it says in Scripture that they came around and attacked the back of the line as the people were coming out of Egypt. You think about that. That's like 1 million people coming out of Egypt. Who's going to be at the back? It's going to be the elderly. It's going to be the moms with infants. It's going to be the little children that can't keep up with the rest, right? And so the Amalekites come around behind and they attack the most vulnerable people of Israel. And they rape the women and they just do terrible things to them. And not only do they do this once, but it's a generational thing. They do it over and over and over again. And God is telling them, don't do this, don't go this way. He's sending them prophets. He's speaking to them saying, you don't want to be like this. And they keep doing it. And so there comes a point in time where God basically says the only way this is going to change, obviously, is if we just get rid of them entirely. Because they are teaching their kids that this is the way to do life. And so he comes to the people of Israel, and he says, I want you to wipe them out entirely. Don't leave women, don't leave children, don't leave animals, don't leave anything behind. You destroy it all so that they are wiped off the face of the earth. Verse 4 goes on and says, so Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Then he said to the Kenites, go away, leave the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you along with them, for you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. So you kind of see what's going on. There's this other nation of nomads, this other group of nomads called the Kenites. They hang around the Amalekites, but they have been good to Israel. They have not done the things of the Amalekites. And so Saul goes to them and says, you may want to back up because we have a big army that's coming in and this is about to get ugly and you probably want to get out of the way. And so they do. They take off and get out of the way. Verse 7. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, to east of Egypt. Then he took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive. And all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. So here we start to see a little bit of a problem, right? God made it really clear. He didn't give them like options here and say, you can do this or this or this. He said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to completely wipe out these people. And what did Saul do with the king? He spared him. And he probably did it to take him around like as a war trophy. You know, parade him around town and show him off to, hey, look at what we did. We've got this guy. You know, probably something like that. But you're starting to see there's this underlying issue here. There's something going on with Saul where he decided not to completely listen to God because there's something else at play here. So keep reading with me and I think you'll see what's going on. In verse 9 it says, but Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and the lambs and everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I'm grieved that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was troubled, and he cried out to the Lord all night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul has gone to Carmel. There he set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone down to Gilgal. So here's another little piece, right? At first we saw there's a problem because he didn't do exactly what God told him to do. He saved the king, he spared the king. Then we find out, oh, well, he spared all the good stuff. Not just the king. He kept the best of the cattle, kept the best of the sheep. He kept all of that stuff. And he's about to encounter Samuel, the man of God, right? And as Samuel comes up, he's going to be like, why have you got a petting zoo here? Why have you got all of these out? You were supposed to get rid of them entirely. And then verse 12 says, you see again another piece, it says that here's what he did. After the war, he went down to Carmel and he set up a monument. And it wasn't a monument to say, look at what God has done. It wasn't a monument to say, God led us into this battle and he's the one who did this. He's the one who won the victory. It says he set up a monument to himself. And again, you start to see, oh, okay, something's going on with Saul. He doesn't have God on the throne of his life. He's being led by something else here. And it looks kind of like pride, but I don't think it's pride. I think pride is part of it, but I think there's a deeper root issue that's happening here. You know what I think is happening? I think Saul is looking around and he's saying, kind of as a new king, he's saying, I really hope these people like me. I want these people to appreciate me and think of me as a great king. I wonder what they're going to think of me if I just destroy everything. I wonder what they would think of me if I really did that. Maybe I should save some stuff so that they see me as an incredible warrior king. So he sets up this monument to himself. But isn't that something that we all deal with? Honestly. I don't know how many of you remember all the way back to like first grade, but maybe you remember that. Maybe you remember changing schools. If you remember going into a new place like that, you kind of remember the feeling, even as a child, of walking in somewhere where it's like, I wonder if I'm going to find a friend here. I wonder if anybody's going to like me. I wonder what they're going to think about me when they get to know me, right? That starts as children in all of us. That's exactly what Saul is dealing with, but it starts with this issue of, I wonder what the people around me are going to think about me. It would be really nice if that went away in second grade, but it doesn't. And you know that. The way that this plays out is the older we get, the more it just applies to different situations. And so there comes a point where I wonder what my family's going to think if I don't provide for them the way that they're used to me providing for them. I wonder what my friends would think if I actually really followed the things that God is telling me to do right now. I wonder what people would think about me. I wonder what people would think if they really knew me. All of the stuff that I keep hidden from everybody else, all of the stuff that I keep pressed down that's in my past that I don't want to come up. I wonder what they would think if they really knew me. And we have these same issues that we wrestle with, and that's what Saul is doing. He's playing this Game of Thrones, and fear is driving him. He's saying, I want to make sure that these people like me. I want to make sure that I impress them. And he even does that as the conversation goes on here. Verse 13 says, when Samuel reached him, Saul said, the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. I don't know if that strikes you as ironic, right? But Saul is saying to Samuel, the man of God, hey, good to see you again. I have done everything that God asked us to do. And Samuel says, really? Are you sure about that? But Saul he's wanting Samuel to like him. He's got this fear of rejection, right? And so he's wrestling with that. Verse 14, it says, but Samuel says, what then is this bleating of sheep I hear in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? It says, I'm looking around and I see these animals everywhere. Where did you get those, Saul? If you did everything that God told you to do, why are those animals hanging around? Why have you got the petting zoo going on here? Verse 15, Saul answered, and this is classic. He says, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. Again, doesn't that just ring true? Isn't this the way it typically goes? When we are driven by fear and we do something that maybe we shouldn't do, we look up when somebody calls us out on it, and look for a way to replace the blame, to move the blame from us to somebody else, right? That's happened from the very beginning. If you read the book of Genesis, you see that when Eve is confronted with the sin in the Garden of Eden, she says, oh, it was the snake. He's the one who drew me into this. It was his fault. And then when Adam is confronted, he says, well, God, I didn't do it. It was Eve. It was this woman. You put her here, and she caused me to. And so it's kind of your fault, kind of her fault, but I didn't know. I'm innocent, right? And that's what Saul is doing. He's just saying, I didn't do anything. That was the soldiers. They just brought all of this stuff on their own. And so he kind of is dismissive of it. But he goes on and says they had a great plan for bringing these back. He says, they spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God. But we totally destroyed the rest. Everything else, we got rid of it, right? Stop, Samuel said to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord told me last night. Tell me, Saul replied. Samuel said, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you as king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Make war on them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? And Saul just wants to keep rationalizing. He just wants to keep pointing the blame somewhere else. And he says this, he says, but I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites. And yeah, I did bring back the king. I brought back Agag, the king. The soldiers took the sheep and the cattle for their plunder, and the best of what was devoted to God in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. So he starts to take a little blame here, right? Well, yeah, okay, I brought the king back. I allowed the soldiers to do this. He starts to take a little bit of the blame. But just to stop for a minute before we move on, I think it's important to note that what Saul is doing is what we so often do. What Saul is doing is he's saying, God, I understand you want me to do this. I know you've told me to do this. But wouldn't it be better if I did this instead? Wouldn't it be better if we changed the rule a little bit here? So it's like us, God saying, I want you to love your neighbor. I want you to invest in your neighbor. I want you to invite them into your world, invite them into your home, love them as you love yourself. God tells us that stuff, and we turn around and say, well, that's good, but, I've had some awkward interactions with my neighbor, God, and so why don't, instead of that, why don't we do this? I'm going to start tagging them on Facebook and telling them every week for the next 2 months that they need to be in church with me, or they need to show up at a church service, or they need you. I'm going to start, I'll send them a note in the mail. I'll let them know that they need to connect with you. Isn't that what you want in the long run anyway, God? Isn't that a better plan? That way I don't have to actually talk to them and confront them, but I still get your message across, right? That's okay, isn't it? That's what Saul is doing here. It's the same thing with us when we look at stuff, at material possessions, and God says, be really careful with the way that you interact with material possessions because they can become your God. They can become the thing that is driving your life. And we look at that and we say, yeah, I understand what you're saying. If you would just let me win the lottery, I will give most of it to you. Like 51% I'm going to give back to you in some way, God. And we start making these promises, right? Yeah, if you'll just bypass this thing you've told me before, I will do this for you, God. Doesn't that sound like a better plan than what you had? Anytime we come up with a better plan than what God has, we're kind of in a dangerous spot. And that's what Saul is doing here. He's saying, God, I know you said to do this, but doesn't this sound like a better plan? We're going to save these animals, save these sheep, so that we can sacrifice them to you. This is all about you, God. That's a better plan than what you came up with. Guys, that's a really, really dangerous place to be when we start saying, my plan is better than yours, God. But that's what Saul is saying here. Going on in verse 22, this is a reply of Samuel that, guys, if you mark things, if you underline things, if you circle things in your Bible, this is one of those verses, okay? This is one of those verses that becomes a theme for the rest of Scripture. Becomes a theme that's seen in Jeremiah and seen in Hosea and seen in the Gospels and seen in the letters of Paul. So listen to the response of Samuel. He says, you came up with a better plan from God than God had. But let me tell you something. He says, but Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice. The heed is better than the fat of rams. He says, here's what God wants. God just wants you to do what he asked you to do. He doesn't want you to come up with a better plan. He doesn't want you to come up with a smarter way. He doesn't want you to come up with something that's going to be better interaction for your neighbors. He says, just do what I asked you to do. That's what matters to me. That's what matters most. This little word in the Hebrew that's translated obey is actually kind of an interesting word. It's the word Shema. And you may have heard that word before because that's the name of a prayer that the Jews pray every single day. And that prayer is just quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and it starts off by saying, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And goes on to talk about loving God and all of that. And the reason it's called the Shema is because it's named after the first word in that prayer. Hear, O Israel, hear. The word that's translated obey here literally means listen. Pay attention to God. Listen to what he's saying. And then just do it. It's not come up with something good on your own. It's not figure this out and figure out a good way to do it. It's just listen. This is what God desires, is that we would listen and do what he's asking us to do. If you're anything like me, you may look at this story and say, man, this seems kind of like a harsh thing here. God's really calling him out over something that seems to be a minor detail. He was compassionate to people. He saved the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to God. And eventually you're going to see that God says, this cost you the kingdom. This means your family line is not going to continue as the kings of Israel. And if you're like me, you may look at that and say, wow, that's harsh. That's big, right? Because he made a few bad decisions, it cost him the kingdom. But you know what God is saying, I believe, to us here? I believe he's saying it's really easy for you to compromise on different things, but obedience matters more than you know. Obedience is a big deal. Listening, hearing the voice of God, and actually doing it is a big deal to God. Going on to just finish out these verses, in verse 23, it says, for rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you, Saul, as king. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, I have violated the Lord's command and your instructions. And listen to this. Listen to what he says next, because here's the root. Here's what has driven all of these decisions. Here's what has pushed him to do the things that he has done. He says, I was afraid of the people, so I gave in to them. The reason I have done all the things that I've done is because I'm letting fear drive me. The reason I carried out the things that I carried out is because I wanted people to like me, and I was afraid they may not like me, and fear has been sitting on the throne instead of God sitting on the throne. And all of this that happened, all of the mess that's caused for Israel and everyone around them, is because of a problem with fear being the leader. Finally, Saul makes a request of Samuel in verse 25, and he says, Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. What you see right there is nothing changed for Saul. He's still saying, will you just come back with me and we'll go worship God together so that the people can see us together and see that the king is with the prophet and they're still one, they're still together. He's saying, I'm still worried about what people are thinking about me. And Samuel says, I'm not going back with you because God has rejected these people. All of the mess because he was driven by fear rather than being driven by God. So how do we bring this to resolution? How do we get to a point where we say, yeah, I recognize that's a problem. I know that I struggle with it. I know that I wrestle with this. How do I get beyond it now? Kind of the big picture thing that we see in this story is we see for Saul that his faith ended where his worries started. So in other words, when he took his eyes off of God and started looking at something else, that's where everything changed. That's where it went from faith to fear, faith to worry. For us, our big idea for the day is just the opposite of that, and that's this. Worry ends where faith begins. When we take our eyes off of the things that are causing us fear, off of the things that are causing us to stay up at night, off of the things that we're worrying about, and place them on God instead, that's where fear ends and faith begins. Worry ends where faith begins. You guys know the stories of the 12 disciples, the guys that hung out with Jesus. You've read the stories in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if you've read any of their stories, you may remember that one of the things that just characterized the disciples was these were a bunch of guys that were absolutely fearful. If you remember the way that they did things, you may remember there was a time where they were out on a boat and waves start coming over the boat. There's a storm that comes out. Jesus is asleep. They run and wake up. Jesus, we're going to die. We're going to die. Jesus stands up and he calms the wind and the waves. Do you remember what he asked the disciples after that? He said, where was your faith? And if you had faith here, if your eyes were on God rather than on the waves, you wouldn't be worried about this. You know that God has this. He says, where was your faith? You go all the way to the cross, and these friends of Jesus, these guys who have hung out with him for the last 3 years of his life, when Jesus is crucified, do you remember what the disciples do? They scatter. Right? They take off. They go all different directions, just like any good friends would do, right? They just take off and run away because they're scared, because they think, this is going to happen to me. I'm next. I can't do this, right? And so they wrestle through all of that, and they run away in fear. And then something happens in the end where there's just this immediate change, where they go from fearful to fearless. And in the midst of that, you kind of ask the question, what happened? What happened that they went from fearful to being guys that they don't care if they're thrown in prison. They don't care if they're being threatened in terms of death. They don't care about any of that. They're just going to follow God. What happened? Do you know what happened? It wasn't that Jesus taught them a new lesson and said, fear not, in a different way. He had told them that over and over. It didn't sink in, right? It wasn't that they finally looked at the miracles and said, oh, he must really be God because of these miracles. It wasn't that. It was that this day called Pentecost happened. And when Pentecost happened, the Spirit of God came to dwell with them. When faith rose inside of them because God was living in them, fear melted away. When faith got bigger, fear got smaller. And I believe that's what God says to us. I believe he says, if you want to take this off the throne of your life, if you want to take this out of the center of your world, if you don't want fear to be the thing that drives you, if you don't want it to be the thing that keeps you up at night, here's what you do. You stop looking at fear and you start looking at God instead. When you're laying awake at night and you can't get this off your mind because you're scared of what's coming or what might happen, he says, stop paying attention to that and you just hang out with me. Just spend time with me. Just connect with me. Just turn your eyes to look at me and it will change everything. Paul, when he was writing a letter to the Philippians, said something about this. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, he says this. He says, do not be anxious about anything. Which, that's the whole thing we've talked about, right? That's a pretty big idea. Don't be anxious about anything. Just don't worry about it. Some people are good at that kind of thing, but most of us, we're going to worry about things. Paul says, do not be anxious about anything, and here's how he says to do it. He says, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. In other words, take your eyes off of the mess, take your eyes off of the thing that scared you, take your eyes off of the worry, and look to God instead. It will change the way you experience life. Take fear off the throne and put God back where he belongs. And it will change the way you experience life. Worry ends where faith